Welcome into another episode of the Autzen Audibles podcast. Erik Skopil, Jared Mack here on Friday of bye week. Fun
Oh yeah.
times.
Yeah.
No
Great
game
time.
tomorrow. Just like sit down, hang out on the couch, watch football for probably like way too many hours. Don't have to worry about deadlines or recording podcasts. Life's good. Can't beat it.
Life is pretty good. There are some games tomorrow. I'm very excited to go watch. Namely Michigan and USC. But really, honestly, Florida, Mississippi State, what fan base chases down their coach out of the stadium first? So my money's on Florida there, but it's still a lot of fun. I do enjoy a bye week. I do miss like the feelings of getting ready for a game and everything,
Sure.
but I could use it. It's been nice.
Sneaky one tomorrow. 0-3 Florida State versus 3-0 Cal.
Yeah, that's probably the game of the week, to be honest with you.
Yeah, definitely.
Don't care about Michigan USC. It's Cal going to Florida State. I think that's the game of the week.
All right. Anyway, today we're going to do what we did a couple of days ago with Matt and I, where we looked through the offense and we looked at the position groups and we talked about some thoughts and kind of some takeaways and what we've learned so far on the defensive side. And this is why I'm hosting, because Jared is our defensive expert. Hi, Jared.
I don't know if I would go that far, but thank you.
I want to change your little name there
My
to
name.
Jared, defensive expert. So, Jared, we're going to break this down very similar to what we did a couple of days ago, Matt and I, where we're going to talk about the defensive line and the linebackers and the defensive backs. But before we kind of get there, like, any broad thoughts on the defense? I know you did a story earlier this week with kind of the stats and kind of where they stack up in the conference, where they stack up nationally. Anything that really stood out there just before we jump into this by group?
Like overall stats wise, Oregon doesn't look great. Like their defense doesn't look great, at least on paper and the statistical categories, especially compared to other Big Ten defenses. I will say I think Oregon has played some tougher competition than some of the teams in the Big Ten. Boise State's a real, potential college football playoff contender. Oregon State was, I don't know, I guess they were 2-0, so good for them. And then Idaho's they're just not a bad FCS team. Oregon obviously should have won that game by plenty of more points, but in general, they're not that bad. And overall, the defense, it's just Boise State that they allowed a lot of points to. A lot of the red zone scores, a lot of the third down conversions. Like there are some glaring statistical problems, but I still really like how the defense has played so far. I think that it'll kind of come back down to earth once they play offenses like UCLA, like Michigan State, like Illinois, where there's not as many talented players on those three teams. Maybe not Illinois. I haven't really sat down and watched their tape yet, but UCLA and Michigan State, like Boise State's offense is probably significantly better than both of those. And I really like Aiden Childs. I think he's going to be good in 2 years, like really good in 2 years, but I don't think he's going to be that good this season, and that's okay because he's a redshirt freshman. But I think the defense, the numbers will come back down to earth or do the opposite. I don't really know how to like. I don't know the numbers like where they are. They're so overly inflated. So I guess coming back down to earth is the proper term. But overall I like the defense.
Yeah, schedule may be favorable too. I just did a story up on the site talking about ranking the teams from here. And after you get past Ohio State, frankly, and I know Michigan, I still throw in there because they're Michigan, but it's not a lot of heavy hitters, and especially on the offensive side. All right, let's jump into this here. Defensive line, your thoughts, your takeaways. I'll kind of jump in and supplement if there's things that you don't touch on. But what are kind of your broad strokes? What are we looking at here with this group?
I think I wrote about some of the takeaways of all the position groups this past week on duckterritory.com. I think my biggest takeaway was how impactful Jamari Caldwell and Derek Harmon have been. The two transfers that they brought in over the offseason. And Harmon leads the nation for interior defensive linemen in pressures, and Caldwell is like tied for 7th or something like that, I wrote. And they're both just really, really good players. And I think that has really supplemented the defensive line heavily because Like I talked about all winter, if you listened to this podcast during the offseason, I was very adamant that they needed to add defensive line help, extremely adamant about it. And I thought they needed to add more players in general, but they needed to go get like a top dog, and they got two top dogs, and that's probably NIL funding that allowed them to do that. But who cares? That's how everybody else did it. And Oregon just got these two dogs. And I think both of these guys, while they've been incredibly important and good through the non-conference, are going to be arguably more important in the Big Ten play just because of the talent that they're going against, where they might have a severe mismatch in favor of Oregon's interior. And Jordan Birch is so much better than he was last year. It's already like automatically. His numbers look better. His like pressure and his like win rate against offensive linemen is just better than it was last year. He's got, I think it's 14 pressures so far this season. He had 27 all of last year. So he's very much on pace to break his number from last year, and then his career high, I think, of 40, which was his final season at South Carolina. The one like major takeaway I've had so far is outside of like their starting 5 or starting 4 on the defensive line, Oregon just isn't rotating.
Mm-hmm.
And it's across the board. And it's the same with the outside linebackers. Like Mateo Uiagalelei and Tatum Tuioti have, I gotta look at this, 118 and 117 snaps. So they are 50-50 or 100-100, however you want to put it.
Mm-hmm.
The next closest actual edge rusher, not including Jordan Birch, is Jaden Moore, who
Our guy.
I'm a big Jaden Moore guy, don't get me wrong. But he has, get this, 16 snaps this year. 16. Yeah. That's 100 fewer, 102 fewer than Tatum Tuioti, if you want quick math right there. Like that's concerning. Like, is Oregon not playing these guys because there's a severe gap in talent, or are they just not playing them because for the last 6 months, every time Dan and Tosh Lupoy have talked about how much they want to rotate their defensive linemen, they're just not doing it all of a sudden? And the same goes for the interior. Derek Harmon has 120 snaps, while Jamari Caldwell has 110 snaps. Next closest interior defensive linemen are Amari Washington at 58, and Keon Ware Hudson at 40. They are not rotating their interior defensive linemen. And I don't get it. Like Jordan Birch is playing 40 to 45 snaps every single game. And that's like the very threshold that Dan and Taj have talked about of where they want to have their guys. They're like, we don't want them to play any more than 40 to 45 snaps a game. It's like, if there was one extra drive, Jordan Birch would be at like 55 snaps a game. So I don't know. It's something I've been trying to keep track of. And obviously injuries kind of derail that. Michael Gardner was hurt. That was somebody who I think a lot of us thought would actually be impactful this year. Ashton Porter has been dealing with some family stuff, and that seemed to be a guy who was second and third on the edge depth chart. So I don't know, but those are some of the main takeaways. I'm probably looking a little too pessimistically at it, but the rotation thing is just like they need to rotate more, or else they're just they're going to get tired. And that was such a strength last year, was them never really getting tired and being able to battle the run all game long.
A couple of things on that. First, on your pressure thing, I would love to see those guys get home a little more and finish the play.
Yeah.
I think it's 30 pressures combined between Caldwell, Harmon, and Birch with 3 sacks. Could do better there. More. I thought it had 30, but you might be right. I when I was looking yesterday,
it's 30 just between Harmon and Birch.
Okay.
Which is
so incredible. Maybe that was the stat I had. Yeah, that was probably the stat I had there in the story. So 30 between those two with 3 sacks, not even including Caldwell. Caldwell doesn't have any sacks, so add on how many ever pressures he's worth.
7.
37 with 3 sacks. That's even a little more egregious. So just finishing those plays probably makes you feel a little better. Like Oregon, as you mentioned, I think has one of the better pressure rates in the country right now, not one of the better sack rates. So love to see that kind of get improved here going forward. Frankly, I don't know what opportunities you're going to have in terms of like these offenses seem on paper to be more run heavy. But if Oregon does what they're supposed to do and builds a lead, there could be some game scripts here where teams are trying to throw at the end of the game, and that leads to some sacks. But that's something to monitor. And then, the rotation part, I agree. A couple thoughts on that. If you blow teams out, you got to play more players, just like point blank.
Yeah, 100%.
So those Idaho Boise State games would absolutely have been opportunities to play more players if those games hadn't been close games. I know you'd like to see more guys play, Jared. I also point out, like, the data there, Birch and Amarion are still playing a decent number of snaps, and they're also edge guys. I know you're not including them because they're not like traditionally edges, but those guys are playing a little bit out there too. It's like, I think Jaden Moore is probably more like their fifth guy as opposed to their third guy, just because we're, I don't know if that's fair or not. But your point remains, like, this is why I was surprised to see Blake Purchase just like not at all in the rotation. And, that's a guy who a year ago, not that he played a billion snaps, but he was averaging like 10 or 12 per game. He's been basically non-existent through 3 games. It's interesting. I don't think, like, fundamentally, Jared, you probably agree. I don't think fundamentally this is why there have been issues against the run necessarily.
I don't know if this is fundamentally why there's been like issues against the run. I think it's kind of hard because I'm not like a tactical nerd when it comes to defenses, so I don't really get it from as deep, not nearly as deep of a introspective job as like Tosh Lepore or Dan does. So I don't really think it's because of that, but I think it's more than just they didn't blow anybody out, so that means they didn't play as many people. Would you like to know how many outside linebackers, defensive linemen, or edge rushers played against Washington in Washington last year?
9.
13.
That's
they
a
played
lot.
13 of them because they had the depth. So that number like kind of coincides with how many they played against Oregon State when they were up by 35 in the fourth quarter.
And that was about the same number. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So they played 13, 14 guys against Oregon State when they're up by 35. But in the closest games of the year last year, they were rotating 12 to 10 to 13 people. So they just don't have the number, or they just don't trust their guys. This is why I was like, they need to add 5 to 7 dudes in the offseason, because that's what they were rotating last year. I don't think people recognize that it was, Taki Taimani, Popo Amovai, Casey Rogers, Brandon Dorless, Jordan Birch, like all these guys were rotating in and out constantly. And they're just not doing that this year. So it's something to monitor moving forward, because I really do think that what Dan and Tosh say about staying fresh and keeping guys like healthier and everything like that, rotating really does help. They're just not playing as much. And football, very physical sport, in case you didn't know. So just something I'm monitoring, because it's not going to get any easier in terms of going against the run and going against physical schools. Like Ohio State and Michigan beat the shit out of people. So you would like all your guys to be as healthy as they could be for those couple games, but just something I'm monitoring.
I think it's fair. And the other part here is I would imagine a week like this, the bye week, and Dan talked about the importance of getting players ready to be contributors. This group here feels like a group that, again, he's never going to get into the specifics and be like, we're really hoping this is the week Aiden Breland and Elijah Rushing really take a step. But those are the types of players that hypothetically could help this group. These are talented players who are very raw that haven't been able to carve out any roles. Elijah Rushing, 5-star kid, hasn't played a snap yet, as far as I know. So where do they manufacture the depth? It's going to be young players, right? And so that's where you're hoping they're developing in the bye week, and then in hopefully a blowout game against UCLA to be able to play more of these guys when they get to the Ohio States, when they get to the Michigans, when they get to the tougher games down the season. Is just something I'm putting out there, Jared. I can tell you're credulous of this.
It's on paper, it is exactly what you're doing, right? It's the same way the wide receiver room was supposed to be good with Justice Lowe, Kyler Casper, and Jurion Dickey. All the young guys who were supposed to be moving up through the years and getting experience and learning the playbook and getting on the field all the time and making the impact. It's like that's exactly how it should work. Does it work all the time? No, sir.
We'll see.
No, it does not. So we will see, absolutely. But I am a little afraid of relying on that because we're 3 games into the year and none of those sophomores or redshirt freshmen have really stepped foot on the field. And you're now relying on 18, 19-year-olds. And I'm just like, this is a team with national title aspirations. Am I wrong?
I'll put my Mario Cristobal voice on and say it's a developmental sport. You got to develop you get guys development over the course of the season.
I know if you're good enough, you're old enough.
Oh, that's Dan.
Nice. whatever that means. It's certainly.
But I mean, I bring that up just because if there is an expansion of a rotation here on both the interior and the edge, it's going to come from first or second year players. And I think it probably is a case, just to kind of put a bow on this one and then move on to linebacker. It probably is a case of a bunch of young guys that you were hoping you'd see a little more early development from that haven't made the strides necessary to be part of these rotations. And Jared, you're right that I was probably a little unfair to say, well, they're not, if they blow out teams, you're going to play more players. Well, the most accurate way to represent the rotations are in close games, and there's been a lot of close games here, and there hasn't been much rotating at all. And that right there is a sign that some of these younger guys just aren't ready. And we're seeing it across the board on this team, where there's a ton of really highly regarded true freshmen and second-year players that are just not playing a lot. And I think it'll be interesting to see. It'd be interesting to come at Ohio State and try to have this conversation and be like, did anybody enter that rotation and play a little bit? Like, does Terrence Green suddenly play? Like, even if it's 8 or 10 snaps, that could be really significant in a game where you're going to get worn out.
That's all some of these guys have to do. Like, if you go back to that Washington game that I talked about, I got it pulled up right here. Like, I got Blake Purchase 6 snaps, Tatum Tuioti 8 snaps. Jake Shipley, God bless him, 9 snaps. Like, that's all you need. You just need to give your big boys or your star defensive lineman, just give them a breather. Like, just, hold down the fort for a little bit. Just let things happen. So maybe it's Terrence Green. Maybe it's Ashton Porter. Maybe it's just somebody else who's on
Tione Gray, who got in there a little bit.
Tione Gray, who looked good against Oregon State. Like, you just need – I'm not saying these guys need to play 20 to 30 snaps a game with everybody else. Like, no, you clearly want your best guys on the field. You need to get those guys as rested and healthy as you can. And that comes with rotating all these guys. So we can stop. We can move on. No worries, everybody who's listening to the defensive line rotation 17 minutes into the podcast.
I think we talked that out plenty, and I think we had we came to some nice conclusions there. That was fun. All right, linebacker, Jared, where again some rotation stuff that's interesting. We've already talked through a lot of this, I think, on the Monday pod. We don't need to get as heavy into the weeds on like why is Jeffrey Bassa playing X number of snaps and why isn't Justin Jacobs playing and why are these guys playing so much, but kind of when you dig in and you did the exercise, what kind of stood out here aside from it? And we can obviously get into that because that plays a big role in what we've seen. But like what kind of stands out most from the linebackers through 3 games for you?
I mean, it has to start with Bryce Betcher, for those who don't know. He's just played out of his mind for 3 weeks now. Former walk-on, also played baseball, started as a safety, moved to linebacker last year, blah, blah, blah. We've all heard the story. He's been great. He's been very, very good. I think his PFF defensive grade is the 3rd highest in the country with linebackers who have played over 100 snaps. Like, absurd. And honestly, when you watch him on the field, every once in a while there's like PFF where you're like, I don't really necessarily agree with that. When you watch Bryce play, it stacks up. Would I say he's the 3rd best linebacker in the country? No, and I love Bryce, but there are more talented linebackers on his own roster than there are across the country. So he obviously jumps out. He's been great. He's been a huge fill-in for this Justin Jacobs and Jeffrey Bassa rotation that just isn't playing for some odd reason. And I don't know. We know that Jeff is more of just an injury thing. It's not necessarily like they're just not rotating or they're rotating too much. Jeff like got hurt against Idaho and has been playing in the past 2 games after that. But really against Oregon State, it was just third down and long situations. There was one play on one third and long where it might have been Giovanni McCoy's like big run in the first quarter on their first drive, and I watched Jeff run after him, and it just wasn't the
Yep.
fastest. It was very reminiscent to 2022 against UCLA, where there was a wheel route from a running back, and Justin Flo tried to go cover him, and you're like, oh,
Mm,
he's not getting there.
mm,
And I'm not
mm,
saying that Jeff is hurt or had that kind of major injury that's going to cause him to be slow like that. But it was like Jeff just isn't 100% here. He's out here on third and longs and he's doing a fine job, but he's not the Jeff Boston we once knew. So maybe this bye week will certainly get him right, and he can come back to being a guy who plays 50 to 60 snaps potentially in a game. But in the meantime, Bryce Betcher and Devin Jackson have done a great job. And I think Devin's been really hit or miss. I think he's had some great games. I thought he was really good against Boise State. And then against Oregon State, he had some moments and then some not so great moments on especially covering the pass. So I really like the linebacker room. I like the talent there. If Bryce is going to play like this, then there's not a lot of worries. Because if I told you preseason that Jeff was going to be not sidelined, but playing at like 65 to 74%, you'd be like, I don't like that.
mm,
I'd rather have him at 100%, obviously. But
mm.
Bryce he's been great, and he's been really helpful in the defense, and he's been really good in pass coverage with it, which I think has surprised me the most. I'll be interested to see if a team like UCLA, who has some kind of pretty good tight ends, will attack those guys a little bit more and try to get to see if they can cover and cover a guy who's 6'5", 240 or whatever it is that Maliki Matavau is. But so far, it's been really impressive.
Bryce has really been solid in pass coverage already too. And I
Yeah,
know, yeah, I mean, like that's something that has stood out to me a little bit is not just his ability to break up passes, which he did on like the first 2 downs in Corvallis to start that game, but also when he doesn't make the play in the air, just right on the guy's shoulders right away, just brings him down.
yeah, he's right there.
Like not a lot of yak allowed from him. I'm totally in lockstep with you in that he's been probably your most impactful linebacker without question, and maybe one of your most impactful defenders on the team through 3 games. And with Bossa being kind of limited the way he is, this has been really imperative for this defense to have someone play
Yeah,
like this, because if you were to have told me going into the season that after 3 games, Bossa and Jacobs have played the kind of snap count, I think it's 50 something less snaps than the combination of Betcher and Jackson, I would say, yeesh, that's probably a bad sign.
not
And
great. Yeah,
you know what? It probably isn't. They're probably not playing to the same level as they would if Jeff was available to play at 100%. Because I remain pretty resolute in the fact that I think he's your best linebacker on this team when he's 100%.
yeah,
But I don't think the play has been awful. I do think, I asked you earlier, do you think the defensive line, some of that rotation, some of the lack of depth, is that fundamentally the issue against run plays? I asked that because in my mind, the issue has been a lot of times the run fits pre-snap with the linebackers, where it's just like you watch and you go, that was kind of doomed from the start. And I go back to that game with Boise and Genty. I think I had the stat of 15 of 25 runs were 4 yards or less, but then he gapped him majorly with like 5 others that went for like 130 yards. And of course, the 70
yeah.
yarder stands out. And if you watch a 70 yarder, that was Bossa, that was Jacobs, and it didn't seem like either of them were kind of in the right spots. And it didn't feel like Kobe Savage, frankly, was either. So, you look at the run defensive stats, and, you mentioned it to lead in, like the numbers don't stack up great in the Big Ten, especially. I
Mhm.
think that has been not to attribute it 100% to one group, but I do think you can point to this group playing a pretty large role on at least a couple of the big explosive run plays that have led to those stats being kind of glaring. Does that feel fair to you? Again, I'm not trying to say it's only the linebacker's fault that the 70-yard run happened, but when you watch that play back, you kind of go, well, it doesn't feel like that was to plan at that group, and that kind of accounted for the opportunity Genty had to make a big play.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly fair. like linebackers, that's their job, man. The defensive line is supposed to get pressure and just try to move the running back off of whatever it is the play is. If it's a counter, just try to get in, cause pressure, and maybe knock over a guard that's pulling. If it's just like an inside zone, you're just running it right up the middle. You want to push back an offensive lineman and kind of get the running back to stumble, and then that gives enough time for the linebackers to read the play and go in and make the tackle. Like that's their job. So on the Genty plays, like yeah, the linebacker group was at fault for a couple of them. It's really hard to ask your defensive lineman to be able to bring down a guy as good as Ashton Genty. But on the flip side, they were really good against Oregon State. And I know people were kind of dismayed about Oregon State's running ability, especially on their only 2 scoring drives. But still, it was just like it's like 3 yards in a cloud of dust. They needed a lot of the times all 4 downs to get a first down. It's just, that's gonna kind of be how it is. It's gonna take up a lot of clock. It's how teams like Stanford used to win, although Stanford had significantly better talent. That's just kind of how it goes sometimes. But they played really well against the run there. I don't have the stats in front of me, but they held them to under just over 100 yards in the entire game, and most of that came in those 2 drives alone. So I think that they're fine, but I think it's certainly fair to say some of these stats are maybe caused by the linebackers, not directly, but kind of indirectly caused by them. It's just tough because no other school has Georgia Southern went against Genty, and that didn't turn out so great for them. Like,
yeah, what are their rushing stats like right now? I bet Georgia Southern's aren't great.
Yeah, it's probably pretty poor. They could have held the next week's opponent to 0 yards, and that still would have been pretty poor. I would like to see. I mean, honestly, I just want to watch Genty go against like the best defenses in the country. I think that'd be a lot of fun. And I think Oregon's one of them, and he just gashed them. So again, like the stats are a little misleading. I think there's certainly some work to do, and I know Dan and Tosh, despite them not wanting to tell us anything about what they're improving on this week, I'm sure that's part of the itinerary plan for the defense.
134 teams playing FBS football. Georgia Southern, 132nd of those teams against the run. So the Ashton Genty effect in pretty clear right there.
Yeah, he's okay.
We're going to take a quick little break here, and we'll come back and we'll finish up with some thoughts on the defensive backs, and then kind of maybe finish with some broader thoughts on the defense as a whole. All right, welcome back to the Autzen Audibles podcast. We talked defensive line, we talked linebackers, talked about some rotational things. I think we're going to have quite a few more things to talk about in terms of rotations when we talk about defensive backs. Why don't we do this and just first let's go into some thoughts on corners, and then we'll go into thoughts on safeties. And then if we want, we can kind of, if there's any overarching things that include both groups. So corner's been a really interesting group to start this season. Like, I know, Jared, you do the defensive 2D projections, and you had Jabbar in there. I think pretty much everybody did. I don't know if you really expected it to be a Nico Dante Manning kind of team up job on the other side, but that's what it's been through 2 weeks, with Cam Alexander barely playing and making his debut over the weekend, and Jaleel Florence, among others, not available right now. Just let's talk about corner. What have you made from those guys?
Yeah, it's been an interesting rotation there too. And like you said, I had Jabbar starting, but who wouldn't? He was one of the best cornerbacks in the country last year. And then I had Cam Alexander because I thought, watching his tape at UTSA, I thought he looked good. He's got the length, the strength. I think he's a good boundary cornerback, a guy who would probably rotate a lot with Dante Manning and maybe Sione Laulea. I think that was what I thought preseason. And then I really thought preseason that Nico Reed was just going to be like a utility man across the defensive backs. Like, he can play star. He can come on. Like, if Brandon Johnson needs a breather, he can go play star. He can go play outside. We haven't seen him line up in like free or boundary safety, but I imagine he cross-trained and could do it potentially. But I really looked at him as like, this is the 6th man. Like, it's like, okay, somebody needs a break. Somebody got banged up on the last play, similar to what it was last year when Kyrie Jackson or Jaleel Florence would get banged up, and it's just like, hey, he needs to sit out a couple plays. Nico, go play outside or go play nickel or whatever the case is. And shoot, he's playing just as much as Dante Manning. I gotta look up the snap counts again, but
I think their counts are really close, if memory serves.
Nico's at 115 and Dante Manning's at 98. So Nico's playing a little bit more, which is I think it's pretty surprising. I genuinely thought that he would just be a utility, like kind of a role player, which every team needs, and that's an incredibly important role. But he stepped up into even a more important role as being like maybe the starting cornerback for the rest of the year. So, and I thought that they've all played very well, including Jabbar, including Dante, including Nico. Like there really haven't been any explosive plays like allowed. I think the longest pass allowed has been 36 yards is what I'm seeing right now.
And do you remember what that play was?
It was a trick play.
Yep. So not a lot of like actually let's line up and play football plays have beaten them over the top.
No, not at all. And I think that's a really positive thing. And I think that certainly helps when you have Jabbar Muhammad on one side of the field, just kind of eliminating guys over there because receivers or quarterbacks specifically are 10 for 20 against Jabbar Muhammad at coverage for like 50 yards. So he's doing his job. Yeah, people are catching the ball on him, but they're not going anywhere. They're not beating him deep. They're just inside slant routes, in routes, like just get me out of here and give me some space. And that's what you want for your number one corner. They're not going to stop everything, but they're going to stop touchdowns from happening. I'll be interested to see what this rotation looks like throughout the season, especially against Big Ten play, because while Big Ten obviously is more run heavy, at least has been in years past, there are some teams who are willing to throw the ball. Like Michigan State, I expect them to be very similar to Oregon State, where they're going to ground and pound, but they're also going to have some play action shots. They're going to try to move the ball, on the ground and then through the air deep. So I'll be interested to see if teams, see Nico Reed and that he's 5'9" and 5'10" and just kind of go after him with a taller receiver or maybe try to switch a tight end out there. I think there's some cause for concern with the size problems in the back end, but we'll see it if it actually takes place. Until then, I think it's been a really good room.
Yeah, I did a story where I ranked the position groups of the team, and I had defensive backs number 2. And in that, I kind of made note that of these guys who are filling in at corner, or I shouldn't say filling, of the guys playing corner, their PFF grades are all very, very solid. Like there's not, you don't look, because sometimes when you look through PFF, and again, we talked about it. I think even in a 3-game sample size, there are things you look at and go like, that feels a little bit too harsh, or maybe they're a little too kind in grading that player. But usually when you look through there's a number that you go, oh my gosh, there's a guy who's like a 47 in there. Like that guy shouldn't be playing. Like what's going on? There's none of that. I mean, those players, based upon how they're being graded by PFF, have been playing very, very well. And I think one thing that really stands out when you look at the counting stats is lead the country in pass breakups and pass defended. They do that by a much larger number than they had last year. I was looking at last year's numbers. Last year, they averaged about 5.5 pass breakups / interceptions. That's what constitutes a pass defended per game. This year, they're averaging 8.4, I think. And last year, they were like 8th in the country. So this is a team that was pretty good at defending the ball in the air a year ago, and they've really stepped up so far this season. Opposing offenses have completed exactly 50% of their passes. I think their QB rating is the opposing QB ratings is one of the better in the country. So to me, this has been probably the biggest strength of this defense. And I think statistically, it's probably weighted a little bit because the quarterback play has, just to be fair, not been good. I don't think, but all 3 of these teams don't have, that they've played probably have better run games than pass games, certainly the last 2. And I think that plays into it a little bit, but I also think this is a really, really good group. And I wanted to ask you this, Jared, what do you think is going on with Cam? Because as you said, like we thought this was a guy who was going to start, and it's kind of similar to a little bit of like a Justin thing where, well, we do know there's been some sort of an injury. Tosh alluded to it at one point, but he's been at every practice, and yet he didn't play in the first 2, and he just got in mop-up duty last weekend. Like, what's going on there?
It's a very good question. One that I don't have a real answer for. I just have a bunch of hypotheticals in this situation because
Yeah.
again, he played really well in the spring game.
Hmm.
He did his part at UTSA where he was a solid corner in his final year. He's got the size, like I said earlier. He's a taller cornerback. It's great. It feels like it would really fit the system easily, and he just, he hasn't played. And excuse me, he's played 8 snaps. He hasn't played meaningful snaps. He hasn't gotten into a
No.
game where things matter. Um, so I kind of chalk it up to a couple of things. One could be the injuries where he's just battling back and he was finally healthy enough to play and he's healthy enough to practice. But so is a guy like Julio Florence who we haven't seen. And so is Gary Bryant Jr., who we haven't seen on the fields. So maybe it's just a situation where he's finally getting back into it. Um, Another one is maybe he stinks, but I don't really think that's it. I think he's a solid player. Um, and I don't think Oregon's going to take a kid who might stink on their football team. My guess, this is my most reasonable
Mm.
guess, not that he stinks, but player development have put Nico Reed and Dante Manning ahead of him. And look, this is a guy who, again, transferred in during the spring, so he's had as much time as humanly possible to understand the playbook. Nico Reed and Dante Manning are in year 2 and year 3 of this playbook. And we've heard for years now, under Tosh Lupoi, year 1 to year 2 is where guys make the biggest strides in growth and understanding the defense and playing the defense with no hesitation, playing free, playing fast, just going and making plays. Nico Reed, year 2. Dante Manning, year 2 was last year. We saw him kind of improve. I thought he played a
Hmm.
lot better than he had in years past. Now he's into year 3 of this defense. So my bet is I don't know anything, and I thought Cam Alexander would come in and just play immediately because I'm an imbecile and I, eat the media narrative like a bunch of cake. And really, Nico Reed and Dante Manning just got better as players and put them ahead. That's my reasonable guess. What do you think?
I think that's probably the case, to be honest.
Yeah.
Because Nico's a guy who I think last year was probably one of the more underrated defensive players. If you go back and just kind of
Yeah.
go through
He
the
was a
season,
do it all. Yeah.
he was great in the slot when they asked him to play there, which he played quite a bit early. And then when they had the injuries to the outside corners, he finished the season starting there. And I won't say it was to the same level as those guys necessarily, but I didn't feel like the drop off was huge. And Dante Manning is like, and this has been probably quote unquote a disappointing outcome for a former 5-star recruit, but this has just been a really reliable like third or fourth corner for 4 years now, right? Like this is a
Mhm.
guy who even back to when Mario was here in 21 was getting, I believe he was the one who filled in and got a couple of starts there for when DJ James was missing. So this is a player who's been around a long time and like fits clearly. He's a 5-star recruit for a reason. He has the physical tools. So I
Right.
kind of lean that direction being the case. And then just one last personnel player to talk about that we don't really have great answers for, but just because I'm sure the listeners are also wondering what's going on with Jaleel Florence. I see this question asked in every
Yeah.
one of our podcasts, all over our message boards, all over social media. People are starting to think this is like a Chris Hudson 2.0 situation. I hate to even get into discussing whether or not that makes sense or not, but this is a guy who like in the spring, I still remember it was like third week of spring, Chris Hampton being like, he's getting close. And
Yeah, he's getting
that was
close.
like half a year ago. And now here we are. And he's seemingly not making, seems like he's in the same spot he was then.
And he just might be, or he might be significantly better, and he's just dealing with a major injury. I think we as a sports society have become too. I don't know how to describe this. There are a lot of players who come back from these major injuries in an incredibly quick fashion. Look at Noah Whittington, right? He's a guy who
Yeah.
tore his ACL literally a year ago, maybe even to this day.
Like this week.
Yeah, and is already back. He's played all 3 games this year, went through spring camp specifically and fall camp, and is now playing. So you look, those are the outliers. And I think I talked about this on the podcast in the fall camp, where he talked about how quickly he was recovering and like how much more he was doing to try to get better for the season and not necessarily following doctor's orders. But I
Yeah.
digress. Um, that is an outlier. That is not the norm. And Julia Florence, you know, really got hurt against Arizona State last year. That was the game where he had been, he was hurt on and off for most of the season, but came back and played against Arizona State, which was in the middle of November. Really got hurt that game. Got his surgery in the off season and is now probably 8 months, 9 months past surgery. That's a normal rehab timeline as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And why, if you're Oregon, why do you need him to come back and risk re-aggravating, re-injuring, whatever the case is? I don't think this is a Chris Hudson situation at all. That is also an outlier situation of what he did. Chris Hudson, mind you, not great. He's not a very good player. Jaleel Florence, when he's on the field and is fully healthy, can be a very impactful player to a defense. And I just don't. Oregon just doesn't need to push it. Jaleel Florence doesn't need to push it. I think that's fine. Did I expect him to be playing this year at this point? Yeah, probably. Was that maybe a little too unrealistic of an expectation? Yeah, probably. So that's my read on it. I think he is just getting healthy. And I think that's okay because we are all stuck on the outliers like Cam Akers when he returned from a torn Achilles in 5 or 6 months, or Aaron Rodgers and Kirk Cousins who are doing these things. And look at them, man. They are not fully healthy. Even Aaron Rodgers, well, obviously he's significantly older, but a guy like Kirk Cousins, who's only 7, 8 months off of a rehab, like he is not healthy. He's out there and he's playing, but he's at some points maybe a little bit of a detriment because he can't push off that right leg and drive a ball through a receiver. So they're waiting. And if he comes back next week, cool, great. Comes back in the middle of the year when they need him the most, great. So I'm not overly worried about that situation.
And Oregon has the luxury, as we talked about before, where they've got incredible amount of depth here, where Cam Alexander hasn't really been involved. He can help fill in. And we've already talked a lot about Manning and Reed. Let's talk about safety here. This was probably, to be honest, my biggest concern, offense or defense, entering the season. In retrospect, I should have been more concerned about the offensive line, clearly. But the reason I was concerned was the lack of coverability or the lack of range you've got with Kobe and Taishim, who are both sub 6 foot safeties, and honestly, probably both closer to about 5'10". Like these are like Buda Baker size safeties. And I was concerned that, okay, are you going to get beat over the top? Are they going to be able to have the speed and the athleticism to make plays downfield? And so far, really haven't been tested in that area. And so far, I think they've held up pretty darn well because you're playing teams that have played to their strengths, which is Taishim was playing nickel last year because he's really good at making plays in space. That's his strength. And Kobe Savage similarly has played a little bit of there too. I think I thought they played pretty damn well, to be honest, so far this season. But again, I think my thing, and Jared, you might disagree, I think we do agree based on past conversations. If/when you face a pass offense that really wants to drive it down the field, I will be curious to see how these guys respond. But through 3 games, that has not been the case. And frankly, I think they played really well.
Yeah, no, I agree 100% on everything you just said. I think when they play Ohio State, that's when we're really going to see, because that was, I would say a problem last year was like the deep threat ability. And again, a lot of that came to light only against Washington. And it was against 3 NFL receivers and a first-round quarterback. So sorry if it stunk. I get it, Oregon fans had lost to Washington, but that was not a great situation if you're a defensive back in general, no matter what team you play for. But yeah, I think that could certainly be a problem because, like you said, these are guys who are 5'10" to 5'11", like maybe, who are going against like covering deep balls. And I think Kobe Savage is kind of cut out of the Evan Williams cloth, where he's very fundamentally sound, great open field tackler, willing to run downhill and go get somebody, but might not be the quick twitch, athletic, really fast guy that can track down a deep ball. And that might come into fruition and hurt them, or it might not. I guess we'll just kind of see eventually. I think specifically against Ohio State, unless Michigan State or UCLA really tries to test them, which they might. You never know. But I think overall, I think they played great. And I think Brandon Johnson has been just a menace. I love that kid. He going into the year, I thought he was going to be a monster. I didn't think he'd be this good, but I think he's so valuable for this defense. And I thought Tyshim Johnson did a really good job last year at nickel. And then you see like, oh, this is how Dan and Tosh really want their nickel to play. And you're like, okay, all right, I get it. I get it. I see how this can be good. And man, he's an animal out there.
He's like the prototype, I think, for what Dan wants in that position.
Yes.
Because he's good.
Absolutely.
He's, to your point about being better than we expected, we were both just like so fired up watching what he did in the box and all the tackle for loss and sack numbers. It wasn't until Tez said something in fall camp about how Brandon Johnson like is running with him on routes downfield where I was like, oh, is this guy who's going to be really impactful in coverage as well? And obviously that has come to pass incredibly well so far with a really impressive interception earlier this season in the opener. And then, of course, a couple of really integral pass breakups against Boise State in big spots too. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, I think the thing with Johnson that gets you excited is to see how he kind of stacks up when they start bringing him a little bit more off the edge on some of those blitzes, which was, I thought, kind of part of the promise of this player. And frankly, something we saw quite a bit last year. Like I go back and think about that Colorado game and all the different defensive back blitzes we saw and how much of an impact that had on a Shador. Like I would be very curious to see, like maybe we see some of that coming up in these next couple of games. We haven't really seen them have to pull those sort of plays out of their back pocket yet. I'm excited to see when he's utilized kind of in that way. Cause to me, that was again, part of the vision I had for what he would look like. And then the other thing I was going to talk about at safety was there probably wasn't a true freshman I was more confident would be like in a rotation. And maybe I was just totally misled on this one than Aaron Flowers. And there just hasn't been a safety that plays a lot other than Tyler Turner. And that was mainly in the opener when clearly Tyshim was suspended or not able to play for some reason.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the safety rotation? Because Tyler is clearly their next guy up, and it feels like Peyton Woodyard, another true freshman, might have the leg up on Flowers, at least based upon what we've seen thus far.
Yeah, he just might. I'm a little surprised by that too. The rotation, I don't know. Oregon really didn't rotate their safeties too often last year. Specifically, Evan Williams and Steve Stevens. Like those guys were on the field as often as they physically could be. And that so far is basically the same thing with Kobe and Tyshim, other than the first half of the first game where Tyler Turner played. And Brandon's been kind of on and off depending on what the defensive line look is like, because Oregon, like I've said on the podcast, where they've gotten to this 5-2-4 front, where they got their five, a couple down linemen and a couple edge rushers. And that takes Brandon Johnson out of the game. That's just the two corners and the two safeties and two linebackers. So he's been kind of in and out. And I think Nico has played a couple drives at star, and as has Dalen Austin. So if you're Flowers, I think his primary position would be that boundary or free safety spot. I don't think he's a star. I think he's could be a very impactful safety in the back end, but they don't need him. And like last year, like for Steve Stevens, like you can rotate in at Cole Martin and feel pretty good about that. And again, they blew out teams every week last year. So except for 2 weeks in the season, they blew out basically everybody.
Well, I'm happy you brought up Cole Martin because I just in my head had said, oh, Aaron Flowers will at minimum be a Cole Martin.
Cole Martin, yeah.
Exactly. He'll be in that similar role. Maybe they'll move him around a little bit, but he'll find a role where he's getting 8 to 15 snaps per game.
Right.
He'll show some impressive things. Maybe he'll pop here and there, and that'll be a transition into next season when both Kobe and Tyshim's eligibility is out, and these guys and he'll be ready to emerge as a kind of we feel really good. We've seen what this looks like. And again, it's very early. As I said earlier, this bye week, maybe we come out and there's different players earning the right to play, but that was a guy I had penciled in as, this is going to be one of the true freshmen that really matters this year. And so far, he hasn't played a single snap. Any other thoughts here? because we're going to finish up on a little ranking of position group exercise. But is there any lingering defensive back thoughts for you?
No, not really. I think I'm pretty good. No, they're just not. I don't know. I haven't seen enough from any of the real young guys like Woodyard or Flowers or Sione or Kingston Lopez hasn't seen the field. So there are some questions there, but I don't know if they'll be answered this season.
Sione, by the way, does seem to play higher up in the reserve hierarchy based upon the Oregon State game where he was out there quite a bit late. Okay. Do you want to just go through? I realized Matt and I didn't go through my position rankings on offense the other day. Do you just want to like run through all this and is it too late in the podcast? Or do you just want to focus on defense?
It's fine.
All right, let's run through this, and you can tell me where I'm wrong, Jared.
No, with pleasure. Yeah.
I know this is your favorite part of the podcast. Is telling me where I made a mistake.
Yes.
All right, 1 through 7. I'm starting at the top. All right, I've got quarterback with Dylan Gabriel number 1. Got the defensive backs number 2. I kind of ran through it right there. I just think that they've been the strength of the defense. Part of this is probably the caliber of passers they've faced, which frankly hasn't been good. 3, I've got pass catchers, which is a combination of receivers and tight ends. 4th, defensive line. 5th, the running backs. 6th, linebacker. 7, offensive line. Obviously, we knew where this list was going to conclude. And frankly, running backs may be higher on this list if offensive line were also higher, because that would indicate a little bit more running space. Where did I make a mistake? What are your thoughts when you hear that order?
So I think I would move pass catchers and defensive line up 1 and then drop cornerbacks down to 4.
Yeah. I think that's fair. I think I'm a bit of a prisoner of the moment of the stats are so staggeringly.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
Like if you look at counting stats, that's the strength right now of this defense. But as I've already alluded to, and kind of retroactively going through this, I still think I'm okay with where they're at. But when you look at the caliber of passers that they've played, it maybe has contributed to like, hey, they're only giving up like 100-something yards per game through the air. No one's throwing the ball down the field. Like that maybe is more to do with. No one's
good.
Yeah, the fact that they haven't played anybody good.
Yeah, and the other thing that I don't think enough people are realizing is that, there's the 17 pass deflections. 17 of them are from Jordan Burch and Bryce Betcher, who, fun fact, aren't in the secondary. So
17 of the 26 are between those two guys?
7 of them. Jordan Burch is credited with 4, and Bryce Betcher is credited with 3.
There you go.
And Tatum Tuioti and Mateo both have 1, and not to like take away from the secondary, but I've just heard that stat brought up a lot, and I'm like, Jordan Burch leads the team in pass deflections, not a secondary player. Like that's where it's kind of like a misleading stat, because just me batting the ball down at the defensive line gives me credit for that. And I think moving the pass catchers, because those are the most talented. That's the most talented group of people on the field at all times. I think just the guys that are in there with Tez and Evan and Trayshawn this year specifically, and Terrence, like those guys are awesome. And I think the defensive line, just the top end talent, is better than the cornerbacks. I think Jabbar is probably the highest player, but if you were to go like, okay, let's list the top 5 players between cornerbacks and defensive line, Jabbar's number 1, and then what's the rest of the top 5? It's got to be defensive linemen, right?
Brandon Johnson might be in there for me, but you're probably right.
That's fine, but
if I were to actually go through it, honestly, if I were to rank the 5 best defensive line / defensive backs, if I were just to do that exercise, I'd probably go Harmon, Birch, Jabbar, maybe Brandon Johnson, and then Jamari Caldwell. I would probably be, just off the top of my head, how I do it.
Right. And then if we were to go like a couple more guys later, like, are you going to put Dante Manning or Nico Reed over Mateo or Tatum?
I might put one of them over Tatum, but you're right. You're right. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just, because I think those are 2 really good veteran corners, but you're right that the top tier talent on the defensive line and edge groups are probably superior to just player by player. If you were to go through it that way, you probably have a strong case.
That's basically like, I think both groups are really performing well. That's just why I would put one in front of the other. I just like the top tier talent on the defensive line more than everybody but Jabbar Muhammad in the secondary, and Jabbar Muhammad and Brandon Johnson in the secondary.
Yeah, I think that's fair. You feel okay with quarterback being number one with Dylan there? That's
Yeah,
nice.
Dylan's awesome. He's very good at his job.
Yeah, no debate there. Yeah, and again, the thing that was interesting, this will be my last comment and we'll wrap, but linebacker, I had them a step below those other groups, but I wouldn't be now, if we're doing the exercise like we just did, where you rank the individual players, I don't think there's really a case for anybody but Jeff entering that kind of upper echelon that we just discussed. Maybe
Correct.
Bryce could be there just because he's playing so well. But I will
Yeah.
say, I think there's a chance that linebacker play will take a step where it doesn't feel ridiculous to kind of include them all in a group where they feel like they're in similar tiers together, because I do think the ceiling at linebacker has a chance to get better and better because they've been what they've been so far. And that's been with Bassa really being at how many snaps has he even played at 100% this year? Like less than 5. Like it was just the very, very first series against Idaho, I think. So,
yeah,
we still haven't really seen Jeff at his best. And I do think that could elevate that group to be reasonably in that conversation. Because I could make a case that if Jeff fully reaches his potential, he's a top 3 player on this defense. I don't think that sounds crazy, or top 4 maybe. I think I'd probably still have Birch and Harmon and Jabbar ahead of him, but I think there's a chance that we see something like that.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think that group can certainly move up. They just kind of have like the short end of the stick right now. Even though they're playing well, it's just there are other groups that are better than them, and that's good. If you're worse, or your worst like defensive group is stacked with some really good talent like that, there are worse things than that. But it's certainly not the offensive line, that's for sure.
Yeah, I felt very comfortable with where they were placed.
Yeah.
There was not a lot of
Didn't have to
debate.
worry about that one. Yeah, I'm not gonna tell you you're wrong there.
I didn't think you would. All right. This has been a lot of fun. I think we covered the defense as I guess, fully as we possibly could in an hour.
I hope, yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, we did spend the first 17 minutes talking about defensive line rotations, which I'm sure was, I mean, frankly, like if I was a podcast listener, what else do I want is like 17
I don't
minutes
know.
on D-line rotations? Like, come on.
Come on. Doesn't get any better.
Enjoy your weekend, Duck fans. Enjoy realizing that you don't have to sweat anything. You don't have to worry about if this offensive line is good this weekend. Like that's all just up in the air, man. That's just like, go watch some other teams, watch them struggle, watch them have bad snaps, watch them shoot themselves in the foot and go, that's not my team this weekend. And we'll be back next week preparing for the UCLA game in Pasadena. We'll have our Monday mailbag and the rest of the shows that week in kind of our normal schedule. This week, obviously, we got a little out of order because it's bye week. But for Jared Mack, this has been Erik Skopil signing off from the Autzen Audibles podcast.
Peace.